The massive crystalline chamber of the Galactic Council stretched impossibly high, its walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that had witnessed 1,000 years of diplomatic discourse. Representatives from 47 species sat in their designated atmospheric pods, each one perfectly calibrated to sustain their unique physiological requirements. The air hummed with translation matrices, converting the cacophony of clicks, whistles, telepathic emanations, and harmonic frequencies into something resembling universal communication. At the center of it all, the Nexus Prime, a being of pure energy contained within a shimmering field, called the emergency session to order. Its voice resonated through every mind present, cutting through the babble of alien languages like a blade through silk. The matter before us today, the Nexus Prime began, its words carrying the weight of cosmic authority, concerns the recent military action authorized against the species designation. Human. Sector designation. Sol 3, Terra. A ripple of satisfaction moved through the assembled delegates. The Zephyrians, with their gossamer wings and compound eyes, chittered approvingly. The massive Krolex delegation, each member resembling a living mountain of granite and metal, rumbled their mechanical approval. Even the ethereal voidlings, beings of pure thought who rarely concern themselves with physical matters, pulsed with what could only be described as smug contentment. Ambassador Thexlara of the Hegemony Coalition leaned forward in her pod, her serpentine form coiling with pleasure. Her species had been among the most vocal proponents of the military action. "The human problem has been dealt with," she hissed, her forked tongue tasting the artificial atmosphere of her containment field. Their aggressive expansion into hegemony space, their refusal to acknowledge proper territorial boundaries, their barbaric treatment of conquered worlds, all of this has been corrected. General Vorthak, the Krolex military commander whose cybernetic implants gleamed like stars against his rocky carapace, activated his communication array. His voice boomed through the chamber like an avalanche. "Confirmed. The human homeworld has been neutralized. Orbital bombardment was precise and thorough. Their shipyards, military installations, and primary population centers have been reduced to atomic debris. The human threat to galactic stability has been eliminated." A chorus of approval rose from the assembled delegates. The Nexus Prime's energy field flickered with what might have been amusement. The Council's decision to authorize preemptive action against the humans was unanimous. Their expansion rate was unprecedented, their military technology advancing at an alarming pace. Left unchecked, they would have destabilized the entire sector within a century. Ambassador Zithka of the Aquarian Collective, her translucent form swimming gracefully within her water-filled pod, added her support. The humans showed no respect for established territorial boundaries. They claimed entire star systems without proper council authorization. They established colonies on worlds already claimed by member species. Their actions constituted a clear violation of galactic law. The Nexus Prime pulsed brighter. Indeed, the evidence was overwhelming. Human settlements in the Kepler sector alone violated 17 separate territorial agreements. Their mining operations in the asteroid belt of their home system disrupted established trade routes. Their military vessels regularly entered restricted space without authorization. What none of them mentioned, what had truly frightened them, was not the humans' expansion or their supposed violations of galactic law. It was their potential. In less than 2 centuries since achieving faster-than-light travel, humanity had spread across 47 star systems. Their technology advanced not through the careful, methodical research that characterized most species, but through wild leaps of innovation that defied conventional understanding. Human ships weren't the largest or most heavily armed in the galaxy, but they were fast, adaptable, and commanded by beings who seemed to treat impossible odds as personal challenges. Human soldiers weren't the strongest or most numerous, but they fought with a creativity and tenacity that had already become legend among the mercenary guilds. Most disturbing of all was humanity's approach to other species. Unlike the carefully stratified hierarchy that governed galactic civilization, humans seemed to view every sentient being as a potential equal. They traded with species the Council considered primitive. They offered medical aid to civilizations that had nothing to offer in return. They formed alliances based on shared values rather than strategic advantage. This behavior was not just unusual, it was revolutionary. And revolution was something the Galactic Council could not tolerate. The chamber fell silent as the Nexus Prime prepared to officially close the matter. Let the record show that the human threat has been eliminated. Their homeworld is uninhabitable, their colonies isolated without the infrastructure of their home system. Those few humans who survived in scattered outposts will either integrate into existing civilizations or fade into extinction. Either outcome is acceptable. It was at that moment that the chamber's massive doors, each one weighing several thousand tons and sealed with energy fields that could withstand the firepower of a battle cruiser, began to move. The sound was like thunder reverberating through a cathedral. Every delegate turned toward the entrance, confusion rippling through the assembly like a shock wave. The doors to the council chamber only opened for 3 reasons: the beginning of a session, the end of a session, or the arrival of a head of state making an emergency address to the full council. The session had already begun. It was nowhere near ending, and no emergency addresses had been scheduled. Through the widening gap between the doors, a figure emerged. It walked with steady, measured steps across the polished floor of the chamber, each footfall echoing in the suddenly silent space. The being was bipedal, roughly 2 meters in height, with a relatively slender build that seemed almost fragile compared to the massive Krolex or the armored hegemony representatives. It wore a simple dark suit that covered most of its pale skin, and its movements had an economy that suggested both confidence and careful control. The head was rounded, topped with short brown hair that had clearly seen better days. The eyes, blue, which was apparently common among its species, swept across the assembled delegates with an expression that was impossible to read. The being came to a stop at the center of the chamber, directly beneath the Nexus Prime's energy field, and raised one hand in what appeared to be a gesture of greeting. When it spoke, its voice was clear and carried easily through the vast space without amplification. Honored delegates of the Galactic Council, it said in perfectly accented Galactic standard, I am President Sarah Chun of the United Earth Coalition. I come before you today to address recent actions taken against my people. The silence that followed was absolute. It lasted for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in the context of high-level diplomatic proceedings. Then, the chamber erupted. Ambassador Thexlara was the first to find her voice, her serpentine form thrashing within her containment pod. Impossible. The humans are extinct. Their world is a radioactive wasteland. General Vorthack's cybernetic systems flared to life as he accessed military databases, his voice cutting through the chaos like a plasma cannon. Confirmed negative. Earth's surface reads 97% uninhabitable. Human population estimated at 0.001% of pre-bombardment levels. The Nexus Prime's energy field fluctuated wildly, cycling through colors that had no names in any terrestrial language. Security. How did this being enter the chamber? How did it breach council security? But President Chen simply stood there, hands clasped behind her back, waiting. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, as the most powerful beings in the galaxy shouted orders and demanded explanations. She waited as security forces flooded into the chamber, hulking enforcers in powered armor, accompanied by floating weapon platforms and energy shields. She waited as they surrounded her, as their weapons powered up, as targeting systems locked onto her position. She waited as the Nexus Prime's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Explain yourself, human. How do you stand before this council when your species lies extinct? Only then did President Chen speak. Her voice was quiet, conversational, as if she were discussing weather patterns rather than addressing the beings who had just committed genocide against our entire species. You're quite right, she said, nodding politely to the Nexus Prime. Earth is indeed uninhabitable. Our primary cities are radioactive craters. Our shipyards are twisted metal. Our orbital platforms are debris fields drifting in solar wind. She paused, her blue eyes moving slowly across the assembled delegates, making contact with each representative in turn. What you fail to understand, she continued in that same conversational tone, is that Earth was never our home. Earth was where we started. But we learned long ago never to put all our eggs in one basket. The chamber fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was the silence of predators suddenly, realizing they might have cornered something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. President Chun reached into her jacket. Several weapon systems immediately locked onto the movement, and withdrew a small device that looked like nothing more than a communications tablet. She activated it with a gentle touch, and the air above the chamber filled with a three-dimensional holographic display. Star systems. Hundreds of them. Each one marked with symbols that even the most advanced delegates couldn't immediately identify, connected by lines that suggested vast networks spanning multiple galactic sectors. Earth, President Chun said, indicating a small blue dot near the edge of the display, was our birth world. It was also our decoy. For the past 75 years, every time humanity established a colony, we established two more in secret. For every research station you knew about, three more operated beyond your surveillance networks. For every ship in our official fleet, five more waited in hidden shipyards scattered across the galaxy. The display zoomed in on different sectors, revealing vast installations tucked away in asteroid fields, camouflage stations orbiting rogue planets, entire fleets hiding in the shadows of nebulae and gas giants. You see, President Chun continued, her voice still maddeningly calm. Humanity has faced extinction before. We've been conquered, enslaved, scattered, and nearly destroyed more times than I can count. But we've always had one advantage over our enemies. She touched the device again, and the display shifted to show massive shipyards, their construction bays filled with vessels that dwarfed anything in the official human fleet. We learn from our mistakes, and we never, ever make the same mistake twice. The Nexus Prime's energy field was now cycling through colors so rapidly that several delegates had to shield their sensory organs. This is impossible. Our intelligence networks are comprehensive. Our surveillance systems monitor every sector of inhabited space. President Chun smiled, the first expression other than calm neutrality she had shown since entering the chamber. It was not a pleasant smile. Your intelligence networks monitor civilized space, she said. Space that follows your rules, reports to your bureaucracies, operates under your oversight. We learned early in our expansion that there was another kind of space. Dark space. Dead space. The spaces between spaces where civilized species don't bother to look. She gestured to the display, which now showed the true scope of humanity's hidden empire. It was vast, far larger than even their official territory had been, and it was everywhere, woven through the fabric of known space like a virus through a host organism. While you were watching our official colonies and counting our registered ships, we were building. While your ambassadors were filing complaints about our expansion rate, we were expanding into regions you didn't even know existed. While your military planners were calculating how to contain the human threat was surrounding you. The chamber was now so quiet that the ambient hum of life support systems seemed thunderously loud. Every delegate sat frozen, staring at the holographic display that revealed the true scope of their oversight. General Vorthak was the first to break the silence, his mechanical voice carefully modulated. "What do you want, human?" President Chun touched her device once more, and the display changed. Now it showed Earth, or what was left of it. The beautiful blue world was gone, replaced by a blackened, radioactive wasteland where nothing would grow for 10,000 years. "What do I want?" she asked, her voice suddenly much quieter. "I want you to understand what you've done. I want you to understand that when you decided to eliminate the human threat, you didn't eliminate humans. You eliminated every human who still believed that peaceful coexistence was possible." She paused, and for the first time, emotion crept into her voice. Not anger, not hatred, but something far worse, disappointment. Earth was home to 12 billion people who believed that we could find our place in galactic civilization. They believed that our differences made us stronger. They believed that the Council represented something worth belonging to. Her voice grew quieter still. Those people died believing that right up until the moment your bombs fell. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Chen's footsteps as she began to walk slowly around the center of the chamber. But there were other humans scattered across hidden colonies and secret installations who always believed that peaceful coexistence was a naive dream. They believed that the galaxy was fundamentally hostile to anything that didn't conform to the established order. They believed that we would eventually have to choose between assimilation and extinction. She stopped walking and looked directly up at the Nexus Prime. "Congratulations," she said quietly. "You've just proved them right." The holographic display above the chamber shifted once more, revealing something that sent waves of shock through the assembled delegates. Ship signatures, thousands of them, moving toward council space from every direction, emerging from the dark regions between star systems like ghosts materializing from shadow. President Chun watched the display with detached interest, as if she were observing a weather pattern rather than a military mobilization that dwarfed anything in recorded galactic history. The humans you killed on Earth, she continued in that same conversational tone, they would have been horrified by what you're about to see. They believed in diplomacy, in finding common ground, in the fundamental goodness of sentient beings. They would have spent years trying to understand why you felt threatened. They would have offered compromises, territorial concessions, anything to avoid conflict. She turned away from the display to face Ambassador Thexlara directly. The serpentine hegemony representative recoiled as if struck, her elegant form pressing back against her containment pod. Those humans are dead now, President Chun said simply. The humans who remain are the ones who never believed in your council, who never trusted your promises of peaceful coexistence, who spent the last 75 years preparing for exactly this moment. General Vorthack's massive form shifted in his pod, cybernetic systems flaring as he processed tactical data. The fleet movements, they're coordinated across 17 sectors simultaneously. Impossible without a command structure spanning decades. Longer than that, President Chun corrected. The Shadow Fleet has been under construction for nearly a century. Every time humanity made contact with a new species, every time we joined another trade network or signed another treaty, we learn more about galactic civilization. Its strengths, its weaknesses, its blind spots. The display zoomed in on one sector, revealing a massive ship unlike anything in Council databases. It was organic in appearance, its hull seeming to flow like liquid metal. Energy readings showed power signatures that made dreadnoughts look like shuttlecraft. The ship you're looking at, President Chun explained, is the Prometheus. It was built in a hidden shipyard orbiting a rogue planet in the Void sector, using resources and technologies you've never encountered. It took 30 years to complete, and it's one of 12 vessels in its class. Ambassador Zithka's aquatic form moved restlessly within her pod, water sloshing as she processed the implications. 12 ships cannot threaten the combined might of 47 member species. President Chin's smile returned, colder this time. You're absolutely right. 12 ships couldn't possibly threaten the combined might of 47 species. That's why we didn't build 12 ships. The display expanded, revealing the true scope of the Shadow Fleet. Hundreds of the massive vessels, accompanied by thousands of smaller craft, all bearing the distinctive organic aesthetic that seemed to blend biological and technological elements in ways that defied conventional understanding. We built 12 different classes of ship, President Chin clarified, each one designed for a specific purpose, each one incorporating technologies that your species haven't discovered yet, and each one crewed by humans who have spent their entire lives preparing for the day when peaceful coexistence proved to be impossible. The Nexus Prime's energy field was now cycling through colors so rapidly that it appeared to be having some kind of seizure. This is madness. The combined fleets of the Council number in the millions. Your Shadow Fleet cannot possibly what? President Chun interrupted, her voice sharp for the first time. Cannot possibly defeat forces that outnumber them 1,000 to 1? Cannot possibly overcome technological advantages developed over millennia? Cannot possibly triumph against the established order of galactic civilization. She gestured toward the display, which now showed detailed schematics of the organic ships. The technology was unlike anything in Council databases. Weapons that seemed to bend space-time itself, shields that absorbed and redirected energy rather than simply deflecting it, propulsion systems that allowed faster-than-light travel without relying on conventional jump gates. You're thinking like civilized beings, President Chun said. You're thinking in terms of conventional warfare, established tactics, honorable engagement. You're thinking like species that have something to lose. She walked slowly around the chamber again, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Every delegate tracked her movement, but none dared to speak. Humans have already lost everything that mattered to us. Our home is gone. Our civilian population is extinct. Our peaceful future is ashes drifting in solar wind. We have nothing left to lose, which means we can do things that would be unthinkable to civilized species. The display shifted again, showing detailed intelligence reports on every council member species. Military installations, population centers, economic infrastructure, technological capabilities, all laid out with surgical precision. While your diplomats were debating whether humans posed a threat, our intelligence networks were mapping every aspect of your civilization. We know the location of every military base, every shipyard, every critical infrastructure node. We know your supply lines, your communication networks, your political vulnerabilities. Ambassador Thexlara finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Intelligence gathering of that scope would require infiltration. Agents embedded at the highest levels of government and military. Yes, President Chen agreed. It would. It would require a network of human operatives so thoroughly integrated into galactic society that they could access the most classified information from every member species. It would require sleeper agents positioned at critical locations across 47 different civilizations. It would require planning on a scale that most species would consider impossible. The terrible implications of what she was saying began to sink in. If humans had been planning this level of infiltration for decades, then every aspect of Council security had been compromised from the beginning. Every military secret, every diplomatic communication, every strategic decision had potentially been monitored by human intelligence. General Vorthack's massive frame shuddered as he processed the tactical implications. The bombardment of Earth, you knew it was coming. You allowed it to happen. For the first time since entering the chamber, President Chen's composure cracked slightly. Pain flickered across her features, quickly suppressed, but unmistakably human in its raw intensity. We knew it was a possibility, she said quietly. Our intelligence networks had detected the preliminary planning stages. We knew that Council military leaders were discussing preemptive action, but we also knew that preventing the attack would reveal the existence of our shadow networks. She paused, her blue eyes distant with memory. The decision was made by the Shadow Council, the governing body of humans who had never believed in peaceful coexistence. They determined that the loss of Earth and its population was an acceptable sacrifice if it preserved the secrecy of our true capabilities. The silence that followed was profound. Even the mechanical sounds of life support systems seemed muted, as if the chamber itself was holding its breath. "You let your own people die," Ambassador Zithka said, her aquatic form moving with obvious distress. 12 billion lives sacrificed for strategic advantage. President Chun turned to face the Aquarian delegate, and for a moment, her mask slipped completely. The pain and guilt were obvious, written in every line of her face. But underneath the pain was something far more dangerous, a cold, implacable resolve that spoke of terrible decisions already made. "Yes," she said simply. "We let our own people die because the alternative was letting our entire species die." Earth's population believed in peaceful coexistence. They would never have authorized a shadow fleet, the infiltration networks, the contingency plans that are about to unfold. Their death is a tragedy that will haunt us forever. But their sacrifice has given the rest of humanity a chance to survive. The display above the chamber changed once more, showing real-time tactical information. The Shadow Fleet was now within striking distance of 17 major Council worlds, including the 3 core systems that served as the heart of galactic civilization. The attack on Earth achieved its intended purpose, President Chun continued. It demonstrated to every human in the Shadow Fleet that peaceful coexistence is impossible. It removed any moral constraints that might have prevented them from doing what needs to be done. And, most importantly, it gave us the moral authority to respond without limitation. General Vorthack's cybernetic systems were working frantically, calculating response times and defensive capabilities. Council fleet elements are scrambling to respond, but deployment will take time. The core systems have planetary shields, orbital defense platforms. President Chun corrected. They had planetary shields and orbital defense platforms. As of approximately 6 hours ago, those defensive systems began experiencing technical difficulties. The display zoomed in on the core systems, revealing the impossible truth. Defensive networks that had protected the heart of galactic civilization for centuries were going offline in sequence. Not destroyed by external attack, but shut down from within by the very people responsible for maintaining them. 75 years of infiltration, President Chun explained. 75 years of placing human operatives in positions of trust throughout Council space. Engineers, technicians, system administrators, security personnel, all of them loyal to humanity first and their adopted civilization second. Ambassador Thexlara's serpentine form had gone completely rigid, her compound eyes reflecting the horror of complete strategic blindness. Sabotage from within. Every system, every defense, compromised. Not just compromised, President Chen said. Controlled. The defensive networks aren't just offline, they're under our command. Every orbital platform, every shield generator, every automated defense system in Council space is now being operated by human agents. The full scope of the disaster was now becoming clear to the assembled delegates. This wasn't an invasion in any traditional sense. It was a coordinated takeover of galactic civilization by an enemy that had been hidden in plain sight for 3 generations. The Nexus Prime's energy field had stabilized into a deep red that seemed to pulse with barely contained rage. This is treachery beyond imagination, violation of every law of warfare, every principle of civilized conduct. President Chen looked up at the energy being with something that might have been pity. Civilized conduct, she repeated. Is that what you call the orbital bombardment of a populated world? The deliberate extinction of an entire species? The murder of 12 billion civilians who had committed no crime other than existing. She gestured toward the display, which now showed before and after images of Earth. The contrast was devastating. A blue-green jewel transformed into a blackened wasteland in the span of a few hours. You want to talk about civilized conduct? Let's talk about the children who died in their schools, the families who burned in their homes, the artists and scientists and teachers who were vaporized before they could even understand what was happening. Let's talk about the civilization that spent 2 centuries reaching for the stars, only to be snuffed out by beings who feared our potential. Her voice grew colder with each word, the conversational tone replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. You attacked our home. You killed our children. You ended our dreams of peaceful coexistence. And now you want to lecture us about civilized conduct. President Chen walked to the center of the chamber once more, standing directly beneath the Nexus Prime's energy field. When she looked up at the assembled delegates, her blue eyes held no trace of the pain and guilt they had shown moments before. Now there was only cold, implacable purpose. The children you killed on Earth will never grow up to become artists or scientists or teachers. They'll never fall in love, never have families of their own, never see the wonders of the galaxy they were born to explore. Their potential died with them in radioactive fire. She paused, letting the words sink in. But the humans who remain have children too. And those children will inherit a galaxy where peaceful coexistence has been proven impossible. They'll inherit a galaxy where survival requires strength, where mercy is weakness, where the only choice is to rule or be ruled. The display above the chamber changed one final time, showing the Shadow Fleet as it reached attack positions throughout Council space. But the ships weren't opening fire. They were simply waiting. You have a choice, President Chen said quietly. You can surrender now, submit to human authority, and accept whatever terms we choose to impose. Your species will survive, though your independence will not. Your civilizations will continue to exist, though under our guidance and control. She gestured toward the display, where thousands of human ships held fire despite having overwhelming tactical advantage. Where you can fight, you can deploy your fleets, rally your defenses, and wage war against an enemy that has been preparing for this moment for 75 years. Some of you will certainly win individual battles. Some of your species will survive. But in the end, you will lose because you're fighting an enemy that has nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The silence stretched on for nearly a minute. Finally, Ambassador Thexlara spoke, her voice hollow with defeat. What happens to us? To our people? President Chen's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained implacable. That depends entirely on you. The Shadow Council has no interest in genocide. We've seen what that looks like, and we have no desire to become the monsters you've already proven yourselves to be. But neither will we allow any Council species to maintain the capability to threaten humanity again. She walked slowly around the chamber one last time, making eye contact with each delegate in turn. Your military forces will be disbanded. Your weapons technology will be confiscated. Your governments will be reorganized under human oversight. Your expansion into space will proceed only with human approval. In exchange, your people will live, your cultures will be preserved, and your species will continue to exist. The Nexus Prime's energy field flickered uncertainly. And if we refuse? If we choose to fight? President Chun stopped walking and looked directly up at the energy being. When she spoke, her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing agricultural statistics rather than the fate of civilizations. Then, you'll join the radioactive ruins of Earth as an object lesson in the consequences of threatening humanity. And the next species that considers attacking human civilians will have 48 examples to learn from instead of just one. The emergency session had stretched on for 14 hours. What had begun as a celebration of humanity's extinction had devolved into a nightmare of revelation and impossible choices. The assembled delegates sat in their pods like prisoners awaiting sentencing, while holographic displays showed the inexorable advance of human forces throughout council space. President Chun had not moved from the center of the chamber. She stood with the patience of stone while the delegates argued among themselves, their conversations a babble of desperate strategizing and recrimination. Some demanded immediate military response. Others called for negotiation. A few had already begun discussing surrender terms. Ambassador Thexlara coiled restlessly in her pod, her serpentine form reflecting the agitation that permeated the chamber. This is intolerable. We cannot simply capitulate to terrorist demands. Terrorist demands? President Chin's voice cut through the arguing like a blade. Is that what you call our response to the genocide of our species? General Vorthack's massive frame shifted, his cybernetic implants glowing as he accessed military databases. The Council's actions against Earth were authorized under Article 7 of the Galactic Security Compact. Preemptive military action to prevent destabilization of established territorial boundaries. President Chun turned to face the Krolex general, her expression unchanged. Article 7. Let me see if I understand this correctly. According to your laws, it's perfectly legal to exterminate an entire species if they pose a theoretical threat to territorial stability. She gestured toward the holographic displays, which still showed the devastation of Earth. 12 billion civilians killed to prevent the disruption of... What were the specific violations again? Unauthorized mining operations? Establishing colonies on contested worlds? Failure to file proper territorial expansion documents. The silence that followed was telling. Even the most hardline council supporters couldn't bring themselves to justify the complete destruction of a populated world over bureaucratic violations. Ambassador Zithka's aquatic form moved restlessly within her pod. The human expansion rate was unprecedented. Your species was growing too quickly, spreading too far. Without intervention, you would have dominated the entire sector within a century. Dominated, President Chun repeated thoughtfully. That's an interesting choice of words. Can you explain exactly how human colonies dominated other species? Did we enslave local populations? Did we steal resources? Did we impose our government systems on established civilizations? The Aquarian delegate's form stilled, her translucent features reflecting discomfort. Well, no, but the potential for future conflicts, President Chun interrupted. You killed 12 billion people because of the potential for future conflicts. Not actual conflicts, not proven aggressive actions, not even hostile intentions, just potential. She walked slowly around the chamber, her footsteps echoing in a vast space. Do you know what humans call that kind of thinking? We call it paranoia. And do you know what we do to leaders who commit genocide based on paranoid delusions? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Every delegate in the chamber understood the implication, and none of them liked it. The Nexus Prime's energy field flickered with agitation. Human expansion violated 17 separate territorial agreements. Your species showed no respect for established boundaries. President Chun stopped walking and looked up at the energy being. Established boundaries. Yes, let's talk about those. Can you tell me how those boundaries were established? Who decided which species got which territories? What criteria were used to determine fair allocation of resources? When no answer came, she continued. I'll tell you how they were established. The strongest species took the best territories. The most technologically advanced civilizations claimed the richest star systems. The founding members of the Council divided up the galaxy among themselves, and Everyone else got whatever was left over. She gestured toward the displays, which now showed territorial maps of council space. The patterns were obvious once pointed out. The core species controlled vast regions of resource-rich systems, while newer member species were relegated to smaller, less valuable territories. Humanity was assigned 12 star systems in the Outer Rim. 12 systems for a species with a population of over 50 billion and an expansion rate that had already filled 47 systems. We were told to compress our civilization into territory that couldn't support even a fraction of our population. Ambassador Thexlara's forked tongue flickered with agitation. The territorial allocations were determined by careful analysis of species needs and capabilities. They were determined by fear. President Chun interrupted. Fear of human potential. Fear of human growth. Fear of human innovation. You saw a species that advanced too quickly, expanded too efficiently, and integrated too successfully with other civilizations, and you decided we were too dangerous to exist. The holographic displays shifted, showing historical data on human territorial expansion. The numbers were damning. Humanity had indeed expanded far beyond their allocated space, but the expansion had been peaceful, voluntary, and mutually beneficial to all parties involved. Every human colony established outside our allocated territory was founded at the invitation of local populations, President Shin explained. We didn't conquer those worlds. We were asked to come by species who wanted human technology, human medicine, human knowledge. We were invited because we offered partnership instead of domination. She paused, letting the implications sink in. And that more than anything else is what terrified you. Not human aggression, but human cooperation. Not our weapons, but our diplomacy. Not our armies, but our ideals. General Vorthack's mechanical voice rumbled through the chamber. Human ideals threatened the stability of galactic civilization. Your concepts of equality, individual rights, representative government. These ideas were spreading to species throughout council space. Spreading, President Chin repeated. Yes, I can see how that will be problematic. Can't have member species getting ideas about self-determination and equal representation. Much better to maintain the existing hierarchy where might makes right and the strong rule the weak. The bitter irony in her voice was unmistakable. The council had destroyed humanity not because humans were conquerors, but because they were liberators. Not because they imposed their will on others, but because they offered alternatives to the established order. Ambassador Zithka attempted to regain some moral ground. The council system has maintained peace for over a millennium. Human ideologies threatened to destabilize agreements that have prevented galactic warfare for countless generations. President Chin's laugh was cold and sharp. Peace. That's what you call a system where 47 species live in constant fear of each other, where territorial disputes are resolved by the threat of military force, where entire civilizations can be exterminated for imaginary crimes. She gestured toward the displays, which now showed military deployment patterns throughout council space. The evidence was clear. Despite claims of peace, every council species maintained massive military forces positioned for immediate deployment against their neighbors. You didn't maintain peace, President Shin said quietly. You maintained a balance of terror. Every species armed to the teeth, ready to annihilate anyone who stepped out of line. The only reason there was no open warfare is because everyone was too frightened to make the first move. The Nexus Prime's energy field pulsed with increasing agitation. The balance maintained stability. Without it, the galaxy would descend into chaos. Without it, President Chun countered, species might actually have to talk to each other instead of pointing guns. They might have to negotiate instead of threaten. They might have to find common ground instead of enforcing arbitrary hierarchies. She walked to the center of the chamber once more, standing directly beneath the Nexus Prime's energy field. That's what humanity offered. Not conquest, not domination, not the replacement of one hierarchy with another. We offered the radical idea that different species might actually be able to work together as equals. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time since the session began, the delegates seemed to be actually considering her words rather than simply calculating tactical responses. Ambassador Thexlara was the first to speak, her voice hesitant. Even if your assessment of council motivations is accurate, the response is disproportionate. You're talking about subjugating 47 civilizations because of the actions of their governments. President Chin's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. You're right. The civilians of Council Space are innocent of their government's crimes, just as the civilians of Earth were innocent of any threat to galactic stability. But we've learned something important from your example. She gestured toward the holographic displays, which now showed detailed population analyses of every council world. We've learned that leaving hostile governments in power, even when their populations are innocent, leads inevitably to future conflicts. We've learned that moral restraint in the face of existential threats is suicide. We've learned that the only way to ensure the survival of our species is to eliminate any possibility of future attacks. The implications were chilling. Humanity wasn't just planning to defeat the Council. They were planning to restructure galactic civilization itself to prevent any repetition of what had happened to Earth. General Vorthack's cybernetic systems flared as he processed the strategic implications. You're talking about permanent occupation, indefinite military control over sovereign territories. I'm talking about survival, President Chen replied. Your species proved that peaceful coexistence is impossible when you have the capability to threaten ours. The only logical response is to ensure you never have that capability again. Ambassador Zithka's aquatic form moved with obvious distress. Our people will never accept permanent subjugation. There will be resistance, rebellion, constant warfare. President Chen nodded thoughtfully. Probably, at least initially. But humans are very good at adapting to local conditions, and we have something you don't, time. We can afford to be patient because we're not going anywhere. Your species, on the other hand, have to decide whether they want to live under human oversight or not live at all. The brutal pragmatism of the statement sent shockwaves through the chamber. This wasn't idle threatening. It was strategic planning based on cold calculation of alternatives. There is another option, President Chun continued, her voice becoming slightly warmer. Complete cooperation. Species that demonstrate genuine acceptance of human authority, that integrate successfully into the new order, that prove they can be trusted never to threaten human lives again. Those species will find us to be very reasonable overlords. She gestured toward the displays, which showed detailed plans for post-conquest administration. The scope was staggering: complete governmental restructuring, military demobilization, economic integration, and cultural exchange programs designed to prevent future conflicts. We're not interested in ruling through fear or brutality, President Chen explained. We're interested in creating a galactic civilization where conflicts are resolved through negotiation rather than extermination. Where different species can work together without the constant threat of betrayal. Where children can grow up without learning to fear the neighbors. The Nexus Prime's energy field flickered with confusion. You speak of peace while threatening conquest. You condemn violence while deploying overwhelming military force. President Chun looked up at the energy being with something that might have been sadness. We're offering you the same peace you offered us. The peace of the grave or the peace of submission. You've proven that these are the only two options in galactic civilization. She paused, then added quietly, the difference is that when you chose to offer us those options, we hadn't actually threatened anyone. When we offer them to you, it's in response to the complete destruction of our home world and the murder of our civilian population. The moral weight of that distinction was crushing. The Council had acted on fear and paranoia. Humanity was acting on demonstrated aggression and proven threat. Ambassador Thexlara's serpentine form coiled with desperation. There must be alternatives. Negotiated settlements, territorial concessions, reparations, President Chen repeated, her voice flat. What reparations could possibly compensate for the extinction of our homeworld? What territorial concessions could bring back 12 billion dead civilians? What negotiated settlement could guarantee that you won't decide to eliminate us again the moment you have the capability? The questions were rhetorical, but they hung in the air like accusations. Every delegate in the chamber understood that no amount of compensation could undo what had been done, and no promises could guarantee it wouldn't happen again. You see, President Chun continued, the problem with negotiated settlements is that they require trust, and trust is something that died with Earth. The humans who believed in trusting other species are radioactive dust. The humans who remain have learned to trust only in strength, only in the certainty that comes from controlling all variables. The holographic displays shifted once more, showing real-time tactical updates. The Shadow Fleet had completed its positioning. Defensive networks throughout Council space had been compromised, and human agents had activated sleeper protocols at thousands of critical installations. The invasion begins in 6 hours, President Chun announced calmly. That gives you just enough time to transmit surrender orders to your respective governments and military forces. Species that surrender unconditionally will be treated according to the laws of war as humans understand them. Species that resist. She gestured toward the display, showing Earth's devastation. Well, you've already shown us what the alternative looks like. The 6-hour countdown had begun, and the atmosphere in the chamber had shifted from shock to desperate calculation. The assembled delegates huddled in their respective pods, engaged in frantic communications with their homeworlds. Emergency sessions were being called across 47 different governments. Military commanders were scrambling to assess impossible tactical situations, and populations throughout Council space were beginning to learn that their universe had fundamentally changed. President Chun remained standing in the center of the chamber, as motionless as a statue. She had dismissed the security enforcers with a simple gesture. They had withdrawn not out of obedience, but because every weapon in the chamber was now under human control, operated by agents who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The first response came from the Hegemony Coalition. Ambassador Thexlara's serpentine form writhed in agitation as she received direct communications from her government. The Supreme Council of the Hegemony demands proof of human capabilities before considering any terms. They refuse to negotiate based on threats and holographic displays. President Chen nodded thoughtfully. Proof. A reasonable request. She touched her communication device, and her voice carried clearly through the chamber. Admiral Reyes, please provide the Hegemony Coalition with a demonstration of human capabilities. The response came immediately through the chamber's communication system, the voice crisp and professional. Acknowledged, Madam President. Targeting Hegemony Military Installation Designation Fortress Proxima. Weapons free. The holographic display above the chamber shifted to show a real-time feed from the Proxima system, the Hegemony's most heavily fortified military complex. Fortress Proxima was a marvel of defensive engineering, a massive installation built into an asteroid, protected by energy shields, automated defense platforms, and a garrison of 50,000 elite soldiers. The fortress appeared on the display as a bright point of light surrounded by the characteristic shimmer of multi-layered energy shields. Then, without warning, sections of the shields simply vanished. Not destroyed or overwhelmed, but deactivated from within. Defense platforms that should have been tracking incoming threats were turning their weapons on each other. The fortress's own missile systems were firing on their launch platforms. Within minutes, Fortress Proxima, the Hegemony's most impregnable stronghold, was tearing itself apart from the inside. When human ships finally appeared on the display, they found no resistance at all. They simply moved into position and watched as the fortress completed its own destruction. Ambassador Thexlara's compound eyes reflected pure horror. Impossible! The fortress was commanded by my own cousin, General Thexmora. He would never. He had no choice. President Chen interrupted gently. General Thexmora is a loyal soldier who followed the orders of his trusted technical staff. Orders that came from human agents who have been part of his crew for over a decade. The implications hit the chamber like a physical blow. If human agents had been embedded at the highest levels of Hegemony military command for over a decade, then every aspect of their security had been compromised from the beginning. General Vorthack's mechanical voice rumbled with barely controlled rage. My species' military installations. How deep does the infiltration go? President Chun consulted her device. Would you like a demonstration, General? Or would you prefer to take my word that the Krolex defense network is currently under human control? The massive alien's cybernetic systems flared with activity as he attempted to contact his homeworld. The silence that followed told the entire story. Even his personal communication channels had been compromised. 75 years, President Chin said quietly. 75 years of human children growing up in council space, attending your schools, serving in your militaries, working in your most sensitive installations. 75 years of integration, so complete that your own people never suspected anything unusual. Ambassador Zithka's aquatic form moved frantically within her pod. The Aquarian Collective's bioneural networks, they're organic, living systems, impossible to infiltrate or compromise. Actually, President Chun said with something resembling sympathy, organic systems are often the easiest to compromise. You just need to understand the biology. And humans have always been very good at understanding biology. The display shifted to show the Aquarian homeworld, where massive bioneural networks that controlled everything from transportation to defense systems were experiencing what appeared to be coordinated seizures. The living computers that formed the backbone of Aquarian civilization were attacking their own support systems, cutting communication links, and systematically shutting down all defensive capabilities. Our xenobiological research teams have spent decades studying Aquarian neural networks, President Chun explained. We've learned how to speak their language, how to influence their decision-making processes, how to convince them that destructive actions are actually protective responses. Your organic defenses are currently protecting you from yourselves. The silence in the chamber was now complete. Every delegate understood that their military forces were not just outgunned. They were already under enemy control. The war was over before it had even begun. The Nexus Prime's energy field flickered with desperate calculation. The core systems, the central defense grid, was built using quantum encryption, molecular locks, consciousness verification protocols. No infiltration could possibly bypass security systems designed by Professor Elena Vasquez of the Human Cybernetics Institute. President Chin finished. Yes, that did present some interesting challenges. Fortunately, Professor Vasquez was one of the 12 billion humans you killed on Earth. Her daughter, who helped design those consciousness verification protocols, had some very strong feelings about that. The core systems appeared on the display, their legendary defenses dark and silent. The quantum encryption had been broken not through technological superiority, but through intimate knowledge of its design. The molecular locks had been opened with proper authorization codes. The consciousness verification protocols had accepted the identities of the human agents who had helped create them. Commander Sarah Vasquez has been serving as a systems analyst for the Central Defense Grid for 15 years, President Chun continued. She's received commendations for her dedication, her innovative solutions to complex problems, and her unwavering loyalty to galactic security. That loyalty was never false, by the way. She genuinely believed in protecting galactic civilization from those who would harm it. The chamber's delegates sat in stunned silence as the full scope of the disaster became clear. This wasn't just military defeat. It was the revelation that galactic civilization had been infiltrated so thoroughly that resistance was literally impossible. Ambassador Thexlar's voice was barely a whisper. How many of our people are actually human agents? President Chun consulted her device. Not as many as you might think. Perhaps 1 in 10,000 across council space. But they're positioned at critical points, communication hubs, defense networks, transportation systems, power grids. We learned early that you don't need to control everything, just the things that control everything else. The mathematical implications were staggering. 1 human agent in 10,000 meant millions of operatives scattered across 47 civilizations. Each one carefully positioned, thoroughly trained, and completely committed to humanity's ultimate survival. The initial infiltration began shortly after humanity's first contact with council species, President Chun explained. Young humans were placed in educational exchange programs, military academies, technical training institutes. They grew up as citizens of your worlds, speaking your languages, understanding your cultures, loyal to your governments right up until the moment their true loyalty was needed. General Vorthack's massive frame shuddered as he processed the tactical implications. Sleeper agents, activated simultaneously across 47 star systems. The coordination required the sacrifice of Earth, President Chun said quietly. The signal to activate came with the first orbital bombardment. Every human agent in council space received the same message at the same moment. Their homeworld was under attack, and peaceful coexistence had been proven impossible. The moral complexity of that statement was overwhelming. The humans killed on Earth had died not just as victims of council aggression, but as unwitting martyrs whose deaths activated a response that had been planned for generations. They believed in peace right until the end, President Chun continued, her voice soft with grief. Even as the bombs fell, even as their world burned, they were transmitting messages of reconciliation and understanding. Their last communications were pleas for negotiation, offers of compromise, desperate attempts to prevent the very response their deaths had triggered. She paused, and, for a moment, the weight of command seemed almost too much for her to bear. But the humans in the Shadow Fleet, we learned a different lesson from history. We learned that survival requires preparation for the unthinkable. We learned that trust must be tempered with vigilance. We learned that peace must be backed by the certainty of overwhelming retaliation. The display shifted once more, showing the current positions of human forces throughout Council space. The numbers were devastating. Not just the Shadow Fleet itself, but thousands of support vessels, supply stations, communication relays, and mobile bases that have been hidden throughout the galaxy for decades. The infrastructure you're seeing, President Chun explained, represents the combined industrial output of 47 hidden colonies over 75 years. Every resource extracted from dark space, every technological innovation developed in secret, every ship constructed beyond the reach of Council surveillance. Ambassador Zithka's aquatic form had gone almost perfectly still. The resource requirements, the coordination, the sheer scale of what you've accomplished, it would require the dedication of an entire civilization. It required the dedication of the part of our civilization that never believed in your promises, President Chun confirmed. While Earth's humans were building art galleries and universities, Shadow Fleet humans were building shipyards and weapons factories. While Earth's humans were composing symphonies and poetry, Shadow Fleet humans were developing new technologies and training for war. While Earth's humans were reaching out in friendship, Shadow Fleet humans were preparing for betrayal. The contrast painted humanity as a species fundamentally divided against itself. One half idealistic and trusting, the other pragmatic and paranoid. The tragedy was that both halves had been proven right. Trust had led to friendship and cooperation, but also to vulnerability and extinction. Paranoia had led to isolation and militarization, but also to survival and ultimate victory. The humans you killed on Earth, President Chun said, they would have been horrified by what we're about to do. They would have pleaded for mercy, negotiated for peace, offered every compromise imaginable to avoid the subjugation of galactic civilization. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of each delegate in turn. But those humans are dead. They died believing in a better future, trusting that rational beings could resolve their differences through dialogue and mutual understanding. Their trust was answered with nuclear fire. The holographic displays now showed detailed plans for the occupation and reconstruction of Council space. The scope was breathtaking. Not just military conquest, but the complete reorganization of galactic society along human principles. What you're seeing, President Chun explained, is the future that died with Earth. A future where different species work together as equals, where conflicts are resolved through law rather than violence, where children grow up without learning to fear their neighbors. The only difference is that this future will be imposed by force rather than achieved through mutual agreement. The bitter irony was inescapable. Humanity would create the peaceful, cooperative galactic civilization they had always dreamed of, but only after conquering everyone who had made that dream impossible through voluntary means. The countdown is now at 4 hours and 37 minutes, President Chun announced. I suggest you use the remaining time to convince your governments to choose survival over pride. The Shadow Fleet will not show the restraint that Earth's humans would have demanded. We've learned too much about the price of mercy. As if to emphasize the point, the display showed additional hegemony military installations going dark as human agents completed their sabotage missions. Each facility that went offline represented thousands of soldiers and support personnel whose loyalty had just been revealed as an illusion. General Vorthack's cybernetic voice was flat with defeat. What guarantees can you offer? What assurances that surrender will actually preserve our peoples? President Chin's expression softened slightly. The same guarantees that Earth received when they offered to negotiate. The same assurances that our children had when they trusted in Council justice. The answer was no answer at all, and everyone in the chamber understood that this was precisely the point. Trust had been broken beyond repair, and the future would be built on power rather than promises. However, President Chun continued, I can tell you what human occupation will look like because, unlike your species, we've actually given thought to the aftermath of our actions. The displays shifted to show detailed administrative plans, human oversight of local governments, gradual integration of council species into human society, educational programs designed to promote cooperation rather than competition. We're not interested in ruling through fear or maintaining hierarchies through violence, President Chen explained. We're interested in creating a stable, peaceful civilization where the events of the past month can never happen again. That requires changes in how you think, how you govern, how you relate to other species. The scope of the transformation was staggering. This wasn't just conquest. It was cultural revolution designed to reshape the fundamental nature of galactic society. In the end, President Chen said quietly, "You'll have the civilization Earth's humans always wanted you to have. The only difference is that you'll have it whether you want it or not." The final hour had arrived. The holographic displays above the chamber now showed the complete tactical picture across 47 star systems. Human forces were in position, defensive networks were offline, and the governments of council space were transmitting their final decisions. Some had chosen immediate surrender. Others were attempting last-minute military preparations. A few had simply gone silent, their leadership paralyzed by the impossible nature of their situation. President Chen had remained motionless through it all, standing in the center of the chamber like a living monument to the consequences of fear and mistrust. The delegates around her had spent the last 5 hours in desperate communication with their homeworlds, and the results are now filtering back through official channels. Ambassador Thexlara was the first to speak, her serpentine form coiled tight with defeat. The Supreme Council of the Hegemony has voted to surrender unconditionally. They request information on transition protocols and assurances regarding civilian populations. President Chen nodded acknowledgement. Admiral Torres will coordinate with Hegemony Military Command to ensure orderly transfer of authority. Civilian populations will be protected according to human military law. General Vorthack's massive frame shuddered as his cybernetic systems processed incoming data. The Krolex Defense Consortium has agreed to submit to human oversight pending negotiation of specific terms. They request retention of local autonomy for non-military governance. Admiral Singh will establish a temporary military government until acceptable local leadership can be confirmed, President Chen replied. Autonomy will be restored gradually as integration proceeds. One by one, the delegates reported their government's decisions. The Aquarian Collective had chosen surrender after their bioneural networks experienced catastrophic failures. The Zephyrian flight clans had voted to negotiate after human agents disabled their atmospheric control systems. The Voidling Consciousness had agreed to submit after discovering that their quantum communication networks had been compromised for decades. 43 of the 47 council species had chosen survival over resistance. The 4 that remained silent represented either governments too proud to surrender or communication systems so thoroughly compromised that official responses were impossible. The Nexus Prime's energy field had stabilized into a deep, pulsing red. The Core Alliance has chosen to resist. Our combined fleets will engage your forces rather than submit to occupation. President Chen looked up at the energy being with something that might have been sadness. I'm sorry to hear that. The Core Alliance represents some of the oldest and most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. Their destruction will be a genuine loss. We will not be destroyed by a species of upstart primitives, the Nexus Prime flared. Our fleets number in the tens of thousands. Our weapons technology spans millennia of development. Our defensive systems are currently under the control of Commander Elena Vasquez and her technical staff. President Chen interrupted gently. The same systems you were so confident could not be compromised. The holographic display shifted to show the Core Alliance's massive fleet formations, opening fire on each other. The legendary Nexus battleships, pride of the Core Alliance Navy, were targeting their own support vessels. Orbital defense platforms were tracking friendly ships as enemy contacts. Fighter squadrons were engaging their own carriers. Impossible, the Nexus Prime whispered, its energy field flickering with disbelief. The command codes, the security protocols, the neural verification systems were designed by beings who believed in the fundamental goodness of sentient life, President Chen said quietly. They built their systems to prevent external attacks, not betrayal from within. They never imagined that the people they trusted most would be working for their enemies. The Core Alliance fleet was destroying itself with devastating efficiency. Centuries of tactical doctrine and technological superiority meant nothing when the enemy was controlling your own weapons systems. Ships that should have been coordinating defensive formations were instead eliminating each other with surgical precision. The engagement will be over within the hour, President Chen announced. Human casualties are projected at 0. Core Alliance casualties complete. The silence that followed was profound. The most powerful military force in galactic history was being annihilated without human ships even firing a shot. The display showed massive dreadnoughts exploding in chain reactions, space stations colliding with each other in carefully orchestrated accidents, and entire squadrons disappearing into the black holes of their own gravitational weapons. Ambassador Zithka's aquatic form was moving frantically within her pod. This is madness. The Core Alliance represents 12 separate civilizations, hundreds of billions of sentient beings. Represented, President Chun corrected. Past tense. Those civilizations chose to fight rather than surrender. They chose pride over survival. They chose to repeat the same mistake that led to Earth's destruction. She gestured toward the displays, which now showed human ships moving into the chaos of the self-destructing Core Alliance fleet. They weren't attacking. They were simply documenting the destruction for historical purposes. The difference, President Chun continued, is that when they chose to destroy Earth, we had done nothing to deserve it. When we destroy the Core Alliance, it's in direct response to their refusal to accept the consequences of their earlier aggression. The moral distinction was crucial, and every delegate understood it. The Council had struck first, without provocation, based on fear and paranoia. Humanity was responding to that aggression with overwhelming but predictable force. Let the record show, President Chun said formally, that the Core Alliance was offered the same terms as every other Council species. Unconditional surrender in exchange for survival. They chose to fight instead. The responsibility for what follows rests entirely with their leadership. The Nexus Prime's energy field was now cycling through colors so rapidly that several delegates had to shield their sensory organs. You speak of responsibility while committing genocide. You lecture about morality while exterminating civilizations. President Chen's expression didn't change, but her voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on the entire chamber. I speak from experience. I've seen what genocide looks like when it targets innocent civilians who pose no threat to anyone. What you're witnessing is not genocide. It's the military defeat of forces that chose to engage human fleets in direct combat. The distinction was important, and she pressed it home with brutal clarity. The civilians of Core Alliance worlds are not under attack. Their cities are not being bombarded. Their children are not being incinerated in nuclear fire. Only military targets and government installations are being eliminated. She paused, then added quietly, "It's the same courtesy that Earth's civilians were not extended." The holographic displays confirmed her statement. Human forces were engaging only military targets while leaving civilian populations completely untouched. Cities remained intact while orbital defense platforms burned. Spaceports continued normal operations while military shipyards were reduced to rubble. The survivors of the Core Alliance military leadership will be given the same opportunity every other Council species has received, President Chen announced. Surrender now, accept human oversight, and live. Continue fighting, and join the radioactive ruins of Earth as a lesson in the consequences of threatening human children. The destruction of the Core Alliance fleet was now entering its final phase. Of the 40,000 ships that had comprised the most powerful military force in galactic history, fewer than 100 remained intact, and those were already transmitting surrender signals as their crews realized the hopelessness of their situation. Total elapsed time for the engagement, President Chun noted with clinical detachment, 43 minutes. Human casualties, 0. Core Alliance casualties, approximately 99.7%. The numbers were devastating not just for their scope, but for what they represented. This hadn't been a battle. It had been an execution carried out with mechanical precision by an enemy that had been planning every detail for 75 years. General Vorthack's cybernetic voice was barely audible. How long? How long have you been planning this? President Chun considered the question carefully. The initial planning began 137 years ago, shortly after first contact with Council species. The detailed operational plans were finalized 96 years ago. The infiltration networks were activated 81 years ago. The Shadow Fleet construction began 75 years ago. The timeline was staggering. Humanity had been preparing for this moment since before most of the current delegates had been born. Multiple generations of humans had dedicated their entire lives to a plan that none of them expected to see completed. You see, President Chun continued, humans learn from history. And our history is filled with examples of what happens when we trust other species to act rationally. We've been conquered, enslaved, betrayed, and nearly driven to extinction more times than most species can imagine. She gestured toward the displays, which now showed historical data from Earth's past, wars, genocides, betrayals, and conquests stretching back millennia. Every time we trusted in the fundamental goodness of other beings, we paid the price in blood. Every time we assumed that rational negotiation could resolve conflicts, we discovered that might makes right. Every time we believed in peaceful coexistence, we found ourselves facing extinction. The pattern was unmistakable, and it explained everything about humanity's approach to galactic politics. They hadn't been paranoid. They had been experienced. The humans who died on Earth, President Chun said softly, they represented our final attempt at trusting other species. They genuinely believed that the Council represented something better than humanity's violent past. They believed that galactic civilization had evolved beyond the primitive barbarism that had characterized Earth's history. Her voice grew harder. You proved them wrong. You proved that the galaxy operates according to the same principles that have governed human history for millennia. The strong dominate the weak. The frightened destroy what they don't understand. The powerful eliminate threats before they become dangerous. The holographic displays now showed the current state of Council space. 43 species had surrendered and were beginning transition to human oversight. 4 species had chosen resistance and were in various stages of military defeat. The transformation of galactic civilization was proceeding exactly according to plan. The irony, President Chin observed, is that you'll end up with exactly the kind of civilization Earth's humans always wanted you to have. Peaceful, cooperative, dedicated to the betterment of all sentient life. The only difference is that it will be imposed by force rather than achieved through voluntary cooperation. She began walking slowly around the chamber one final time, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. Species that integrate successfully into the new order will find themselves with more freedom, more opportunity, and more security than they ever had under the Council system. Species that resist will discover that humans can be far more ruthless than any enemy they've previously encountered. The delegates sat in stunned silence as the full scope of their new reality became clear. Their entire civilization had been conquered in less than 24 hours by an enemy they had thought they had already defeated. Everything they thought they knew about galactic politics had been revealed as naive delusion. The transition period will be difficult, President Chen acknowledged. Old hierarchies must be dismantled. New systems of governance must be established. Entire populations must be re-educated to think in terms of cooperation rather than competition. She stopped walking and looked around the chamber one final time. But the alternative is extinction, not just for your governments or your military forces, but for your entire species. The humans who remain have learned to think in terms of absolute solutions to absolute problems. The Nexus Prime's energy field flickered weakly. And when your reorganization is complete, what then? President Chen's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since entering the chamber, she seemed almost human rather than a force of nature made manifest. Then, she said quietly, we'll have the galaxy that Earth's children dreamed of but never lived to see. A galaxy where different species work together not because they're forced to, but because they've learned that cooperation serves everyone's interest better than competition. She paused, then added with genuine sadness, it won't bring back the 12 billion people you killed. It won't undo the destruction of humanity's homeworld. It won't heal the trust that died with Earth. The holographic displays shifted one final time, showing not tactical data or administrative plans, but images of Earth as it had been. Blue oceans, green continents, gleaming cities, and orbital installations that had represented humanity's highest achievements. But it will ensure, President Chun concluded, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, that no other species will ever again face the choice between assimilation and extinction, because there will be no one left with the power to force that choice upon them. The chamber fell silent as the delegates absorbed the finality of that statement. The age of the Galactic Council had ended. The age of human hegemony had begun. And, in the radioactive ruins of Earth, 12 billion ghosts bore witness to the birth of the galaxy their deaths had made possible.